Father, Forgive Me by Raymond Harvey. A host of slim shafts of sunlight beaded their way through the perforated partition onto Father O'Neill's perspiring face. Tiny particles of dust swam aimlessly from beam to beam. This hot Irish summer was dragging on one monotonous hot day after another. Father O'Neill was finding life hard these days. His black clothing always sucked the sun's heat to his body as he trudged along the dry, dusty streets of his village, and it was always a relief to him when he could shut himself away in the comparative shade of the confession box. He dabbed his moist handkerchief lethargically from one part of his glistening face to the other. It got so stifling in this confined space after a while, and when you had to sit and listen to Mrs. Casey holding forth in the adjoining booth, it made you feel that you'd already spent a lifetime there. It's not only that, Father, her thin voice prattled through. But I've told him 6 children is enough for me, so it will have to be enough for him. Now I ask you, Father, have I done my bit? Father, are you still there? Father O'Neill straightened himself quickly from his drowsy slouch. Normally one didn't get the opportunity to say much with Mrs. Casey, and he had been caught unprepared. Yes, I'm listening, my child, he assured her, thinking to himself how ridiculous it sounded, he, merely 32 years of age, calling this mother of 6 his child. I know it's difficult, but remember we are here for a purpose, to multiply. That is God's wish. Multiply is it indeed, she cut in. I'll tell you this for nothing, Father. It's all right for you single men to talk, but as far as I'm concerned, moi multiplying days are over, and that's a fact. Good day to you, Father. He watched her thin black silhouette against the mesh as she stood to go. He hadn't handled that one very well, but with Mrs. Casey it was always best to leave her to go her own way, so he had discovered in his 18 months here at Killinmore. In the end, whatever Mrs. Casey said went, so to disagree was usually as effective as Canute's attempt to stop the tide. The thumping shut of the door as she left stung his tired nerves. He poured himself half a tumbler of water from the glass bottle. The water tasted stale and was lukewarm, but he didn't pause until he had drained the glass. He wondered if there would be any more for him. One advantage of being in a village as small as Killinmore was that tedious duties were soon over because of the low numbers. Ah well, he'd rest here in peace for another 10 minutes or so, and then go on his way. He had just closed his eyes and rested his head against the wall when his nerves jolted to life again as a result of the same offending door. By holding his head well back from the mesh at a slight angle, he could always make out enough of the person's features to know who was there, and Father O'Neill, like the Boy Scouts, always wanted to be prepared. He squinted inquisitively at the screen. Oh no, that's all he needed. First Mrs. Casey, and now John Flynn. He knew within his heart of hearts that he should have compassion for this poor creature. Due to a prominent purple birthmark, John Flynn's face could only be termed as disfigured. The blotchy stain had made such an impression on O'Neill's brain when he first saw it that he could picture it quite clearly now in the next booth, despite the partition. John Flynn was about 3 years younger than himself, and as a result of the branded appearance of his face, needless to say he had been unable to attract or impress any members of the opposite sex. As a result, John had now accepted that for him the only sex experience he would ever have was that which he practised with a few of his own sex in the village. Unfortunately, John Flynn interpreted Father O'Neill's celibacy as a good omen, and had the embarrassing habit of pressing his case whenever an opportunity presented itself. "Are you there, Father?" John's thick voice oozed through the mesh. "Yes, my son," he answered cautiously. "I have a great confession to make, Father." "God is merciful to all that are repentant," said Father O'Neill, striving to give his own voice the note of authority he knew he needed when dealing with John's infatuations. "I love you, Father O'Neill, and I can't go on much longer without—" "Stop that this instant," O'Neill cut in. "You must stop this fetish of yours, you—" "But I can't stop it, Father," he hissed back through the tiny gaps. "You must, you must." Father O'Neill realised his own voice was rising as a trace of panic crept into it. "Find yourself a woman to love, my son," he continued, struggling to retrieve some dignity into the conversation. "God wants you to marry, have children, and live a good life." "Marry? Marry? Me? Marry?" he squawked back in disbelief. "If he wanted me to get married, why did he give me this face? Eh? Answer me that if you can." Father O'Neill ducked his head back sharply from the mesh to relieve his nostrils from the putrid-smelling breath that had seeped through as a result of that outburst. "Control yourself," he said, keeping his head turned as he spoke. "Who are we to try to understand God's reasons? If he'd wanted me to marry a woman, he wouldn't have given me this face. He meant me to love you and want you. I know it, I can feel it." John's thick, dirty fingers scratched against the mesh as he pleaded for recognition. "Please, Father, be kind to me. You must know what I'm going through. You must be lonely yourself. I could do wonders for you, Father. Honestly, I could. Give me the chance, and I know you will get to feel the same way about me, and then you won't miss not having a woman either. Please, Father, please help me." The poisonous stench in the hot, stale air and the scratching nails had driven Father O'Neill back against the farthest wall in his cramped cell. He found the remarks as obnoxious as the foul odour. He was at a loss for words. He merely cowered back in his corner, waiting for the attack upon his senses to cease. But there was more to endure. "Aren't you supposed to help your parishioners by administering to their needs? Well, what about my need? Why am I to be left unfulfilled?" Father O'Neill made a determined effort to end this fiasco. "My son, God cares for all his children. You must have faith. Now go and reflect upon what I have said." "But I want—" burst back the voice. But Father O'Neill was adamant. "Go and reflect," he repeated sternly, and held his breath, hoping and praying that he had commanded sufficient authority in his voice to subdue John Flynn. The banging which he had found so irritating earlier was like music now, as the noise of the slamming door in the adjacent box reverberated in his ears. He waited until the clopping footsteps faded in the distance before he exhaled his own sigh of relief. What a day he was having! Still, these things are sent to try us, he thought profoundly. The trouble was that they made such a good job of it. He wriggled his swollen feet painfully back into the pinching shoes and loosely tied his laces. That was as much as he could take for now, and as all seemed silent around him, he decided to leave his prison for some fresh air. He was in the act of pulling to the rust-infested gate when he caught sight of a solitary figure waiting at the corner of the church wall which he had to pass on his way home. The blue smudge on the distant white face immediately placed him on his guard. He lingered where he was on the pretext of fiddling with the brown-coated chain on the gate. What should he do? If he went on his normal way, John was bound to accost him. and an unpleasant scene would invariably follow. He no longer had the sanctity of his church to protect him. He would open the gate and return to the church as if he had forgotten something, but then the chances were John would still be there when he came out again later. But at least such a move would give him more time to try to solve his predicament. On the other hand, he could go in the opposite direction. It would mean a longer and wearier route through the blazing heat, but that would be the lesser of the two evils. His fingers trembled with the rattling chain as he summoned up his courage to execute whichever decision he conceded to. The prospect of going the other way was the more attractive, apart from the risk that John may decide to follow him and make a fresh onslaught when he had reached a lonelier spot. "Are you chaining yourself to the gate now, father?" He swung his head round to see where the voice came from. To his relief, it was Mrs. Casey's eldest daughter, Mary, who stood there smiling at him. "Oh, Mary, it's you," he said. "Forgive me, I was deep in thought. I didn't notice you coming." "Is it my mother that's been after giving you so much to think about then?" she asked cheekily. No, of course not, my child. How lucky we all are to have such a good woman like your mother to sustain us all. Indeed, yes, a fine woman. You're not going my way by any chance, Mary, are you?" he asked, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. "As a matter of fact, I am, father." "Why, do you fancy taking a walk with me then?" she teased. "Now, Mary, behave yourself. A young girl like you should know better than to say things like that to me," he said, strategically moving to one side of her before they started walking towards the waiting John. "Oh, come off it now, father. You're as much a man as the rest of them under your clothes, maybe more so," she said, raising her eyebrows wickedly. But Father O'Neill was too busy concentrating on trying to look relaxed and natural as they walked alongside the church wall to be shocked by anything his life-saving escort had to say. "Good day, father," said John, looking directly at him as they passed. "Good day to you, John," he answered quickly, diverting his eyes from the crescent mark on John's left cheek to Mary's gay yellow mini-dress. "Hello, Mary," added John, also admiring the yellow curves. "I like that dress you're wearing." I suppose you mean you like what's inside it, don't you, John Flynn?" she answered with disdain. John's face hardened with a glare of hatred. His slow brain struggled for an apt rejoinder to the taunt, but as no sound emerged from his working mouth, he contented himself by pouring his enmity through his eyes at her departing back. "That was not a very charitable thing to say, now was it, Mary?" said Father O'Neill when they had moved out of earshot. "Come off it, father," retorted Mary hotly. "You know what he's after as well as I do, so don't play the innocent with me." This sudden broadside shut him up completely. He contented himself to walk along in silence at her side, thankful that her presence had solved his predicament. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that John was rooted to the same spot, but still following them with his eyes. He was always amazed that Mrs. Casey had succeeded in producing something as attractive as her daughter Mary had turned out to be. But he was also worried that this girl of a mere 17 years should be so worldly and brazen about sex and life. She glided along beside him, her long copper-coloured hair flaming in the sunlight, her head held erect and fearless. She was already a mature woman physically, and he could easily understand why she was so sought after by all the males in Killinmore. They turned off the road and followed the baked mud path through Highfield Woods. "Now you're not pouting, are you, father?" Mary asked, suddenly looking at his frowning face. "Pouting? Me? Glory be, no, Mary. Whatever gave you that idea?" he asked. "You know, father," she said speculatively, "the trouble with you is that you take life far too seriously. You should try and let yourself go more." He laughed at the very idea. "No, I mean it, father," she persisted. "Look at yourself. You're still a young man. You should get some enjoyment out of life before it's too late." "And what makes you think I don't enjoy life?" he asked, still smiling. "I don't think. I know you don't. How can you? You can't go out with a woman. Ah, but my vows, he interrupted. Oh, you and your vows. You're just developing into an old maid going round dressed in black with everybody calling you father. Now let's face it, is that your idea of letting your hair down and enjoying life? Well, is it? But you see, I'm here for a purpose, Mary, he began in earnest. Oh yes, and what purpose is that, Michael? She stopped and leaned against a tall pine tree to watch his reaction. Mary, he said, his voice riddled with shock, you must call me Father O'Neill, not Michael, she helped out. Oh, come on, everybody knows you're Michael O'Neill, and we're alone here, aren't we? I'm not embarrassing you in any way, so where's the harm? Well, there is no harm, I suppose, he said, hesitantly. Well then, that's settled, she said. Whenever we're alone, I'm always going to call you Michael. It'll be our secret, she whispered as if it was all part of a conspiracy. Have you heard the one about the nun in the convent? She continued, leaving the tree and trudging on. One day she went to the Mother Superior and said, I've been sleeping with St. Michael. Mary, is this some kind of joke? He burst in sharply. She turned and looked at him. Well, if it isn't, things are beginning to look up for the nuns, aren't they, Michael? Anyway, the Mother Superior is shocked just like you are in this minute, Michael. And she says, I don't believe you. How do you know it was St. Michael? So the nun says when the morning bell went, he left in such a hurry. He forgot his underpants, and here they are. See, they've got St. Michael on the tab inside them. Mary laughed happily at her own joke, and the sight of her laughing along with the farcical joke forced Michael to smile back at her. I don't know what I'm going to do with you, Mary Casey, he said, shaking his head. Promises, nothing but promises, she said, skipping away from him smartly, as if she were expecting him to retaliate. She plopped down on the prickly pine needle carpet around a tree and lay back against it. Phew, it's so hot, she complained. Let's have a rest for a few minutes. He sat down alongside her and mopped the beads of sweat off his face with his handkerchief. I thought you'd be more of a gentleman than that, Michael, she said just as he was beginning to get comfortable. He looked at her in bewilderment. What on earth was she talking about, he wondered. The puzzled look on his face prompted her to continue. Now don't you think it's unkind of you not to offer a poor girl your coat to sit on to protect her young flesh from all these prickly needles? He struggled instantly to his feet. My dear Mary, how thoughtless of me, he said, peeling off his jacket. Allow me to offer it now. He laid it on the floor and watched the golden hairs on her bronzed legs twinkle as she squatted upon it. Ah, that's better, she sighed. Thank you, Michael. He settled down again, feeling spiritually uplifted for the first time that day by his helpful deed, but also feeling a little apprehensive at the effect Mary's weight and the needles would have on his best black jacket. Still, a good stiff brushing would do the trick. It would have to, because it would be a long time before he could afford to buy himself another. But this was being materialistic, which would not do at all. So he lay back, infusing his brain with the feeling of satisfaction at his Christian act. He put his hand behind his head, but quickly changed his mind as the smell of sour sweat wafted from the patches of stained shirt at his armpits. He sat up and propped his back against the tree with his arms folded, self-consciously, in an effort to smother the smell. His efforts were interrupted by the crisp rip of Mary's zip. He looked to see what she was doing, and was rather taken aback to see that she had lowered the zip that ran down the front of her dress a good 9 inches. Mary, he said, aghast, realizing from the amount of her breasts he was able to see that she had nothing on under her dress. What is it, Michael? She asked, purposely displaying a mask of innocence. Your dress, Mary, he said, turning his eyes away as if to protect himself from corruption. But it's so hot, Michael, she answered. Now you wouldn't begrudge me a little cooling air, would you? Not at all, Mary, he said, still looking at the taut laces of his left shoe. But, do you need quite so much? Her gurgling laughter unsettled him even more than her sudden unzipping. He was now beginning to feel just a little uneasy in the presence of Miss Mary Casey. "Oh, you're a real coward, Michael, and that's a fact," she said, stretching her body taut in the shade of the tree. "Well, I must be getting on my way now," he said nervously, beginning to clap away the dead clinging needles from his trousers. "No, not yet," she said sharply, sitting up and eyeing him calculatingly. "What I mean is you can't go just yet because, well, you haven't heard my problem, have you?" "Problem?" he repeated, looking at her, then quickly averting his eyes as they alighted on the cleavage of her smooth breasts. "What problem could you possibly have, Mary?" He heard the rustle of the needles as she lay down again. "Well, Michael, let's pretend. Just pretend now, mind you, that I was pregnant," she said carefully. "Pregnant?" he echoed, his voice sounding an octave higher than normal. "I mean..." He cleared his throat and regained control of his voice. "Pregnant, did you say, Mary?" "Yes," she affirmed. "Now, if that were the case, how do you think my mother would react to the news?" "Well, oh yes, well, I think she'd... Oh dear." "I don't know what to say." He stumbled for the right words. "Well, Mary, it's difficult to say really. And suppose," Mary cut in, "she was told that the father was not a Catholic. What then?" Not a Catholic? He realised he was beginning to repeat everything she said, but seeing as she kept coming out with such outrageous remarks, then it wasn't really surprising. "Well, if that were true, Mary, then I think she would be very, well, annoyed with you," he ventured hesitantly. "I would say she'd give me hell. Oh, forgive me, father, but oh, you know what sort of treatment I'd get. I'd be shown the door on the spot, and then what?" Mary's voice was becoming quite excited as she envisaged her mother's uncontrollable temper in the situation. "Yes, I know, Mary," he said, looking at her flushed face. "So let it act as a further deterrent to stop you doing anything so foolish." She propped herself up on one elbow and looked him straight in the eye. Then in a voice that was a little more than a whisper she said, "But it's too late, Michael. It's already happened." He could think of nothing to say. He just stared blankly back at her as she toyed with the brass ring on her zip. "So you see, Michael, you're my only salvation," she said, looking as if she was sorry for him, not for herself. "I know it's going to be terrible for you, but, well, that's me. I'm afraid I'm a very selfish person, and I worry about myself first, and it's not my fault that I've got such a tyrant for a mother, is it?" "I don't know what to say, Mary," he said, still in a state of shock. "If I thought anything I could say to your mother would help you, well, I'd try, of course. It would be my duty. But, well, she is such a difficult woman at times that, well, you know what I mean." "Oh, I know only too well," she said, slowly sliding her zip down a few more inches. But this time he made no protestations. He merely observed the augmented view as his brain wrestled with this latest dilemma. The zip had now crawled slowly down even farther, allowing her yellow dress to yawn open. He could only sit there transfixed as her young proud breasts were unveiled before him. Even her voice was unable to break the trance her beauty held him in. "Do you like what you see, Michael?" she coaxed. "Mary, I think you have a wonderful body," he croaked weakly. "Would you like to see more?" she said, easing the zip lower still until the edge of her thin black nylon panties emerged to break the line of her bare brown skin. "Oh, Mary," he gasped, completely overcome by the vision of beauty before him. "Well, you've done enough window shopping. What about coming in for a free sample?" she invited, taking the zip to the very bottom of her dress. For years his masculinity had been bottled inside him under a cover of controls and vows, and restrictions until now suddenly this touchstone had erupted before him. His moist palms itched to smooth and fondle their undulating way all over her. The beads of sweat that trickled into meandering rivulets on his face were now a result of the nervous strain as well as the heat. "Come on, Michael." Her voice was a smooth whisper. "I'll help you. Don't be afraid." She slid her thumb between her skin and the top of the black gossamer nylon and tantalizingly dragged its wrinkling form a little lower. "Come on, Michael," she urged. "You do it for me." His right hand had already left his knee and was travelling hesitantly towards hers when a wave of cold fear flushed some of the hot, thumping blood clear of his head. His hand wavered short of the target as another icy spray lashed a fresh attack upon his confused brain. His whole body froze. He hesitated in his purpose, the hot sweat seeming to chill all along his back. "My God, what am I doing?" he hissed desperately. He smacked his hands together and locked his thumbs between his teeth. He shut out all further temptation by jamming his eyes shut tight. Helpless, whimpering gulps escaped between his trapped thumbs. He tried to shut out her voice, as well as everything else, so that he could do justice to his prayers pleading for help and strength. "You pathetic little worm." Her voice raged in his ears. "I bet you don't even know what to do. You're giving it on a bloody plate, and look at you. Just look at you." She glared at the sitting statue before her. "You don't think meeting you and getting here was pure chance, do you? Well, do you?" She roared at him but got no reaction. "If only you knew how much I've worried and how many sleepless nights I've racked my brain for a way out of the mess I'm in. But it's nearly over for me now, and believe me, it's just starting for you. Do you hear me?" She screamed at him, but the blind mute did not move. "Wake up and listen, will you?" she shouted, cracking her open palm across his head, but this merely provoked a fresh flow of whimpering. "Holy Mother, will you look at him?" she grated through her clenched teeth. "Open your eyes, will you, and look at me." This request obviously registered because he shook his head violently. "Right, have it your own way, but remember this trick didn't do the ostrich much good," she spat out at him. "In a few minutes I'm going to run out of these woods with my dress all ripped, and I'm going to cry my story out to everybody I see of how you raped and ravished me here on your own coat." His eyelids sprung open, and he stared in horrified disbelief at her. "Aha, that's made you think, hasn't it?" she said triumphantly. "And it won't be any good you denying it, because remember John Flynn saw us coming in here together. Well..." His mouth opened and his hands flopped heavily to his lap. The expression of fear and terror on his face compelled Mary to stop and gloat at the effect her ranting had had on him. She stood up and stared triumphantly down at him. Then, bending slowly so that her face was inches away from his, she said quietly, "And when I finish screaming out there, I bet a few people will rush in here, and a fine state they'll find you in." As she spoke, she gripped the bottom of her dress with both hands and pulled with all her strength until the thin linen rasped apart in protest. She stepped back from him, a wily smirk on her face. "Then think how my dear mother will feel in a few weeks, when some of the fuss and bother has died down, and her dear daughter, who had suffered so terribly at the hands of the sex-raven O'Neill, tells her that she is pregnant. Why, I'll be nursed with more care than all my younger brothers and sisters put together. I'll have the sympathy and love of every living soul in Killinmore." She stood in front of him, legs apart, her dress gaping and torn, but her body erect, savouring the triumph to come. The rustling of the crisp needles induced her to look at him again. He was shuffling towards her on his bent knees. "Don't think of things like that, Mary," he pleaded, pathetically. "Our God is a kind, forgiving God. Come, kneel with me, please. We'll pray together here, now." Her long hair splayed out as she threw her head back and laughed. "Please don't laugh, Mary," he begged, gripping the backs of her knees with his hands. "You'll see it will be all right. Have faith, please." "Oh, get up off your knees. You make me sick," she mocked. "Please, Mary, listen to me," he said earnestly. "I'll come home with you now, this very minute, and I'll speak to your mother for you. I'll see that no harm comes to you, I promise." As he spoke, he moved his fingertips up to hold the back of her warm thighs. But Mary, excited with her triumph, only laughed louder at each of his wailings. "Stop laughing, Mary. Please listen to me. I mean every word," he said, gazing beseechingly upwards at her. But she continued to laugh, setting her round breasts quivering spasmodically with the effort. But the dark, protruding tips failed completely to stimulate him as they danced on their trembling mounds. "Mary, stop it!" he screeched up at her suddenly. "Stop laughing, Mary. I can't stand it. Do you hear, Mary? Stop!" He tightened his grip on her legs and pulled them hard towards him. The unexpected force upset her balance, and she toppled with a shrieking giggle backwards. But even this failed to stem the peals of laughter. If anything, it seemed to him to increase the volume. He was now beginning to panic at the possibility of someone being attracted by the noise, coming to investigate and finding him and Mary in this state. He crawled clumsily between her splayed legs and leaned over her. "Shut up, Mary! Stop it, Mary, for God's sake!" he screamed at her face, a fine spray of spittle peppering her bare throat. "Stop, stop, Mary!" But nothing he said seemed to have any effect on the bared teeth and vibrating tongue. His right hand was wedged down on something hard and cold. Still trying to drown her gurgling with his shrieking voice, he swung his right hand across her face. Immediately her erratic peals of laughter changed to the single, higher note of a scream. He crashed his hand against her face yet again. A gush of bright red blood spurted free as the mashed remains of her left eye slopped onto her cheek. It hung there, suspended by a few twisted red strings, while the flooded socket pumped a steady scarlet flow around it. He thought the pitch of her scream was going to shatter his eardrums any minute. Her long nails clawed desperately into his shirt as her body squirmed beneath him. He pounded again and again, until the red stone was too slippery for him to hold any longer. Exhausted, he dropped the stone and rolled slowly off her. The screaming had stopped at last, although the mouth was still open. The split lips hung in shreds into the toothless bleeding gums. Pieces of splintered teeth lay embedded in the oozing redness that had once been a tongue. He put on his coat to hide the blood splashes and slipped the slimy stone into his pocket. If he was lucky enough to get home without being seen, he would be able to destroy the evidence. There was nothing for it. He would have to get a new suit now. He took a last long glance at the ivory-white body with its mound of undulating red pulp surmounted by long strands of matted hair. Then he dashed off for home, struggling to control his chilled stomach from being violently sick until he got there. A week after the tragedy, Father O'Neill was kneeling in prayer in his confession cubicle. In the last week he had spent so much time on his knees that already his new black trousers was beginning to show the strain. He was interrupted from his appeals for mercy and forgiveness by the familiar clatter of the door in the next cubicle. He sat in his place and forced himself to clear his mind as best he could to listen to the confession. "Hello, Father O'Neill. It's me, John Flynn." The familiar voice was accompanied by the familiar stench. "I have a confession, Father. Last Saturday I followed yourself and the poor Miss Mary into the wood, and I committed the terrible sin of being a peeping Tom." Father O'Neill sat rigid in his box without uttering a single word. "Now I thought to myself, Father," the voice continued, "how terrible it would be for the church and yourself, Father, if I told the police about what I'd done and what I'd seen. So I decided if you were nice to me, Father, and let me come and stay with you, then I'd never have to tell them about it, would I, Father? Hello, Father O'Neill? Are you still there?" But Father O'Neill made no answer. He was down on his knees praying as he had never prayed before.